Title: The Whispering Shadows. Chapter 1. The Silence Begins. Ethan had never really understood silence. True silence, as he discovered in those first days, was something that felt almost unnatural. When he closed his eyes, he swore he could hear it pressing in, tightening around him. At first, the quiet was a welcome relief, a break from the chaos of the world outside. The news had warned them of the infection sweeping the city, people attacking each other in an animalistic rage, spreading the disease faster than anyone could contain it. "Lock your doors. Stay inside," they'd said, and that was exactly what Ethan had done. The first day, he listened to the sirens. They wailed endlessly, echoing down streets like ghostly cries in the dark. Each time they faded, he wondered where they had gone, what nightmare they might be rushing toward. He imagined people, neighbors, strangers, running, screaming, all trying to escape something they couldn't see. But then, slowly, the sirens began to grow less frequent, until by the second night, the city had fallen into a deep, unnerving hush. Ethan tried to keep himself occupied in those early hours. He had an emergency supply kit, water bottles stacked in neat rows under the sink, and enough canned food to last him at least a few weeks. He hadn't expected the silence to bother him so much. He was an introvert, after all, perfectly content with solitude, or so he thought. He even tried to convince himself that he could enjoy it, a break from the noise and obligations of everyday life. By the third night, the silence had transformed. It had a kind of weight, pressing on his chest like some invisible, suffocating force. It felt like something was listening, waiting. He'd walk from room to room, trailing his fingers along the walls, feeling the hum of electricity in the wires, as though they were the only remaining signs of life. The whole building was like a tomb, and he was its sole inhabitant. Sometimes he would lean his ear against the wall, straining to catch a sound, any sound, from the other apartments. A cough, a shuffle, even the hum of a refrigerator. But all he heard was his own breathing, the rapid thump of his heartbeat, pounding louder and louder in the emptiness. The thick, muffled silence seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around him like a shroud. The silence started to play tricks on his mind. Ethan would sit by the window, peering down at the empty street below. Shadows would shift, but when he looked closer, they would be gone. Just the flickering of a street light, he told himself. Just his tired mind playing games. And yet there was something lurking, something watching. He could feel it, just beyond his line of sight, hiding in the darkness. His eyes would strain in the gloom, searching for movement, but each time he found nothing. His days blurred together, an endless cycle of pacing from room to room, sitting at the window and listening, always listening. He tried to read books, watch old DVDs on his laptop, anything to occupy his mind, but the quiet pressed in on him, filling every corner of the apartment, every empty second. The moments of distraction grew shorter, the creeping unease longer. By the fifth day, Ethan noticed something strange. The city didn't just feel quiet. It felt hollow, drained of life. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the air seemed thinner, colder. There was a staleness that clung to everything, as though the very essence of the city was rotting away. He opened a window to let in fresh air, but all that came in was more silence, more of that awful emptiness. On the sixth day, he started to hear sounds. They were faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable, soft, shuffling footsteps. A whisper, so low that he wasn't sure if he'd heard it at all. "Ethan." The voice was barely there, just a breath, but it sent chills up his spine. He dismissed it at first, blaming his own mind, the oppressive isolation, the way shadows seemed to crawl along the walls when he wasn't looking. But the whispers continued, growing louder each night, as if someone, or something, was slowly drawing closer. He'd lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the soft murmurs that seemed to come from just beyond his door. Sometimes, he thought he could hear scratching, as if fingernails were dragging along the wood. His heart would pound, each beat echoing in the stillness, but he never dared to get up and check. The seventh day was when the dreams began. They were vivid, more real than anything he experienced in his waking hours. He'd find himself standing in the hallway outside his apartment, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in dark, oozing stains, and the lights flickered overhead. He could hear the whispers, closer now, urgent, beckoning him to follow. He'd walk down the hallway, his feet moving of their own accord, drawn toward a door at the end. A door that shouldn't have been there. It was old, made of dark, splintered wood, and as he reached for the handle, he'd wake up, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. Ethan tried to shake off the dreams, but they clung to him, the images lingering at the edges of his vision even during the day. He'd catch himself staring at his own front door, the urge to open it growing stronger with each passing hour. He'd pace back and forth, his eyes darting to the door, his hand twitching at his side. Something was waiting for him out there. He could feel it, a presence dark and insistent, pressing against the other side of the door, willing him to let it in. By the 8th day, Ethan was unraveling. The whispers were constant now, a low murmur that filled the apartment, drowning out his thoughts. He couldn't tell if they were real or just in his head. He'd cover his ears, squeezing his eyes shut, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. "Ethan, open the door. We're waiting." They knew his name. They spoke to him like they knew him, like they were part of him. He stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he'd see that hallway, that door. He'd feel the cold, rotting wood beneath his fingers, the whispers wrapping around him like a fog, pulling him forward. He was afraid that if he fell asleep, he'd never wake up, that he'd open the door in his dream, and whatever was on the other side would take him. On the 9th day, Ethan heard something new, a knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it echoed through the silence like a gunshot. He froze, his eyes locking on the door. The knock came again, a little louder this time. He took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The whispers rose, a chorus of voices urging him to answer. His hand moved toward the doorknob, trembling, his mind screaming at him to stop, to run, to hide. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere that the silence, the whispers, couldn't reach him. He stood there for what felt like hours, his hand hovering over the doorknob, the knock repeating at irregular intervals. It never grew louder, never more insistent. It was patient, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side knew that he would give in eventually. The whispers promised him relief, an end to the isolation, to the suffocating silence. All he had to do was open the door. Ethan didn't remember falling asleep, but he must have, because when he opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor, the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains. The apartment was quiet. The whispers were gone. The knocking had stopped. For a moment, he thought it was over, that maybe he'd imagined it all. But then he saw the door. The doorknob was slick, wet, as if someone had been holding it with a damp hand. Dark stains trailed down the wood, pooling on the floor beneath. Ethan stared at it, his stomach twisting, a cold dread settling over him. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the stain. It was thick, sticky, and the smell. It was the same smell from his dreams. Mildew and decay, and something else, something metallic. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers might have stopped, but whatever was outside, whatever had been knocking, it was real. It had been here, just on the other side of the door, waiting for him to let it in, and he knew deep down that it would be back. The silence was only the beginning. The real nightmare was still to come. Chapter 2. The Visitor. Ethan could feel the weight of the silence even more after that night. It seemed denser, more oppressive, as if every empty second was charged with some unseen presence that clung to his skin. He had spent the morning pacing, his eyes darting to the door every few minutes, half expecting to see it swing open on its own. The thought of that slick, stained doorknob haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever had touched it was still close by, watching. He tried to distract himself, making coffee that tasted of ashes, flipping through the pages of an old book without absorbing a single word. His eyes kept drifting to the door, the dark stains still visible against the pale wood. There was something undeniably sinister about it, a mark left by something not entirely human. He thought about scrubbing it off, but every time he approached the door, his body would seize with a cold terror, and he'd find himself backing away. By the afternoon, the whispers had returned, faint, barely audible, like a soft rustling that came from just beyond the walls. Ethan sat on the couch, his hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. The whispers didn't speak his name this time. Instead, they murmured in a language he couldn't understand, a guttural, wet sound that made his skin crawl. He turned the television on, trying to drown them out, but the screen only flickered with static, the white noise blending with the whispers, creating an eerie, almost melodic hum. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the dim light in the apartment seemed to fade with it. Ethan hadn't turned on any of the lamps. He didn't want to move. The whispers grew louder in the dark, and he could feel the cold seeping in from the edges of the room, the shadows deepening, stretching toward him. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the door. The knock came again, just as it had the night before. Soft, patient, echoing through the apartment like a heartbeat. Ethan flinched, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the door, his body rigid, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. His mind screamed at him to stay still, to stay quiet, but his legs seemed to have a will of their own. He stood, the blanket falling to the floor, his feet moving slowly, dragging him toward the door. The knocking continued, steady, rhythmic, as if whoever was on the other side knew he was coming. His hand trembled as it reached for the doorknob, the dark stain glistening in the dim light. He could feel the cold radiating from the metal, a chill that seeped into his bones, and for a moment, he hesitated, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Ethan," the voice whispered, louder now, clearer. It was coming from just beyond the door, a voice that sounded almost familiar but twisted, distorted. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong. But the sound of his name, spoken so softly, so intimately, made something inside him ache. He was so tired of the silence, of the emptiness. He just wanted it to end. His fingers closed around the doorknob, the slickness making his skin crawl. He turned it slowly, the latch clicking, the sound echoing through the silence. The whispers fell quiet, as if they were holding their breath, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating through his body. He pulled the door open, just a crack, enough to peer through. The hallway beyond was dark, the lights flickering weakly, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. At first he saw nothing, just the empty hallway stretching out before him. But then, slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was hunched, its limbs too long, its movements jerky, unnatural. Its face was obscured, shrouded in shadow, but Ethan could see its eyes, dark, sunken, staring straight at him. They were filled with a hunger, an emptiness that mirrored the silence that had consumed his apartment. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen, his fingers still gripping the edge of the door. The figure moved closer, its head tilting to the side, as if studying him. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. They urged him to open the door wider, to let the figure in, to end the silence once and for all. He couldn't move. The fear held him in place, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind screaming at him to close the door, to lock it, to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, its face coming into view, and Ethan felt his stomach twist in horror. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over its bones. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, its teeth yellow and sharp. The eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, bore into him, and Ethan felt something inside him break. The whispers grew louder, more demanding, the voices overlapping, blending together into an unbearable noise. Ethan's head throbbed, his vision blurring, his hand shaking on the doorknob. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against the edge of the door, and Ethan felt a cold, slimy sensation spread through his body, as if the touch had infected him, tainted him. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hallway, the sound of glass shattering, and the figure flinched, its head snapping to the side. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Ethan blinked, his vision clearing. his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The figure stepped back, fading into the shadows, its eyes never leaving his. And then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the empty apartment. He locked it, his hands shaking, his entire body trembling. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He backed away from the door, his eyes wide, his mind racing. The whispers were gone, but the presence remained. He could feel it, just beyond the door, waiting, watching. Ethan collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands, his body trembling. He didn't know how much more of this he could take. The silence, the whispers, the figure. It was all too much. He was losing himself, losing his grip on reality. He could feel the fear consuming him, eating away at his sanity, and he didn't know how to stop it. The hours passed slowly, the darkness outside deepening, the cold seeping into the apartment. Ethan didn't move from the couch, his eyes fixed on the door, his mind replaying the events over and over again. He could still see the figure, its eyes, its smile. He could still feel the cold touch of its fingers, the slimy sensation that had spread through his body. He felt contaminated, tainted, as if some part of that thing had stayed with him, wormed its way inside him. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hallway, the figure, the way it had looked at him, the hunger in its eyes. The silence was unbearable, the whispers gone but their memory lingering, echoing in his mind. He wanted to scream, to shatter the silence, to drown out the memory of those voices. But he knew it wouldn't help. Nothing would help. The silence was inside him now, a part of him, and there was no escaping it. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Ethan finally moved, his body stiff, his muscles aching. He stood, his legs unsteady, and walked to the window. The street below was empty, the city still, lifeless. He wondered if there was anyone left out there, anyone who wasn't like the figure in the hallway, twisted, hungry, empty. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his eyes closing, a tear sliding down his cheek. He was alone, truly alone, and the silence was all that remained. Chapter 3. The Encroaching Shadows. Ethan spent the next few days in a daze, his thoughts clouded, his body moving out of necessity rather than will. The events of that night replayed over and over in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the figure, those dark, hollow eyes staring at him, that grotesque smile twisted across its face. He shivered, the memory of its cold touch lingering on his skin, as if it had left a mark, invisible but always there. The silence in the apartment was heavier now, as if it carried the weight of the presence that lurked beyond his door. Ethan found himself jumping at the slightest sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the sound of his own breathing. Everything seemed magnified, the quietness amplifying each noise until it was deafening. He began to wonder if the silence was inside him, not around him. It felt like it had sunk into his very bones, twisting and stretching inside of him, a parasite feeding on his fear. He stopped looking at the door. Just the sight of it made his heart race, his stomach twist with anxiety. He started spending most of his time in the back room, the furthest away from that cursed door. He would sit by the window, staring out at the empty streets, hoping to see some sign of life, but there was nothing. No cars, no people, no birds in the sky. The city was dead, and Ethan was a lone survivor, trapped within the carcass of what once had been a bustling place. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They never truly stopped. They had simply grown more subtle, lurking beneath the surface of his thoughts, surfacing when he least expected them. When he tried to sleep, when he let his mind wander, they would rise up, a low murmur just beyond his understanding. They spoke of things he could not comprehend, of shadows, of hunger, of an endless darkness that stretched beyond the edges of his perception. He would cover his ears, press his face into his pillow, but they were always there, whispering, urging him to listen. One night, after what felt like hours of staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, Ethan heard something different. It wasn't a whisper, but rather a soft scratching, like fingernails scraping against wood. His breath caught in his throat, and he lay there, frozen, straining to hear. The sound was coming from the door, a slow, deliberate scratching that seemed to go on forever. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, his body rigid with fear. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the sound to stop, but it didn't. It grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side knew he was listening, knew he was afraid. The scratching turned into pounding, a slow, rhythmic knock that echoed through the apartment. Ethan clamped his hands over his ears, his eyes watering, his heart racing. The whispers returned, a chorus of voices mingling with the pounding, drowning out his thoughts. "Ethan," they whispered, the sound slithering into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a serpent. "Ethan, let us in." He felt his resolve breaking, his fear giving way to something else, something darker, more desperate. He was so tired of the silence, of the emptiness. The voices promised him release, an end to the loneliness, to the constant fear. All he had to do was open the door. He found himself standing, his feet moving on their own, drawn toward the hallway. The air grew colder as he approached the door, the light dimming until the shadows seemed to reach out for him, wrapping around him like tendrils. The pounding had stopped, replaced by a silence so profound that it seemed to press in on him, suffocating him. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Just open it," the whispers urged, their voices sweet, comforting. "We're waiting for you, Ethan. We'll make everything better." His hand closed around the doorknob, his fingers trembling. He could feel the cold metal beneath his palm, the slickness of the stain that had never quite gone away. He twisted the knob, the latch clicking, and slowly, he pulled the door open. The hallway beyond was empty, the lights flickering weakly, casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. Ethan stepped out, his bare feet touching the cold, tiled floor. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. He looked down the hallway, his eyes straining in the dim light, and for a moment, he thought he saw something move. Just a flicker, a shadow darting across the far end of the corridor. He swallowed, his throat dry, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a step forward, then another, his feet moving soundlessly across the floor. The whispers were louder now, filling his mind, drowning out his fear, his reason. They guided him, urging him forward, promising him an end to the silence, an end to the loneliness. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows growing darker, deeper, until he could barely see his own hands in front of him. The walls were covered in stains, dark patches that seemed to pulse and writhe in the dim light. The air grew colder with each step, his breath misting in the darkness. He could hear something moving just beyond the edge of his vision, a soft, slithering sound that sent shivers down his spine. At the end of the hallway, a door appeared, old and splintered, the wood dark with age and something else, something wet, glistening in the dim light. Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his ears, his body trembling. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging him forward, telling him to open the door, to let them in. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the wood, the surface cold and slick beneath his touch. He could feel the presence on the other side, something dark, something hungry, waiting for him. His hand closed around the doorknob, and he turned it, the latch clicking, the sound echoing through the silence. The door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond, a darkness so deep, so absolute, that it seemed to swallow the light, to consume everything in its path. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, his breath catching in his throat. He could hear something moving in the darkness, a soft rustling, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Come to us, Ethan," the voices called, their tone sweet, inviting. "We've been waiting for you." He took a step forward, his foot hovering over the threshold, the darkness reaching out to him, wrapping around his leg like a cold, clammy hand. He hesitated, his heart pounding, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn back. But the whispers were too strong, their pull too powerful. He stepped into the darkness, the air around him growing colder, the shadows swallowing him whole. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the whispers fell silent, leaving nothing but the sound of his own breathing, the pounding of his heart. For a moment, there was nothing, just the darkness, the silence, the cold. And then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes dark, empty, staring at him. It reached out, its fingers brushing against his face, and Ethan felt a chill spread through his body, a cold so deep that it seemed to freeze his very soul. The figure smiled, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp yellow teeth. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his fear, his reason. "You're ours now, Ethan," they whispered, their voices echoing through the darkness. "You belong to us." Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness closed in around him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, until there was nothing left. Nothing but the cold, the darkness, and the voices that consumed him. He was lost, swallowed by the shadows, his mind unraveling, his soul slipping away into the endless void. And the whispers, those terrible, insidious whispers, were all that remained. Chapter 4. The Descent. There was no sense of time in the darkness. Ethan didn't know if minutes or hours had passed since the door had shut behind him. The cold enveloped him, chilling him to the bone, as if he were sinking into an endless abyss. The shadows pressed against him, moving like living things, brushing his skin with cold, ghostly fingers. He could feel them, whispering, tugging, urging him to let go, to surrender to the void. The darkness was endless, an oppressive presence that seemed to swallow everything. Light, sound, even his thoughts. Ethan tried to reach out, to find something to hold on to, but his hands moved through empty space, touching nothing. He felt weightless, lost, as if his body no longer belonged to him. He tried to remember why he was here, what had happened, but his thoughts were sluggish, slipping away before he could grasp them. Then the whispers began again. They were soft at first, a distant murmur that seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the emptiness. Ethan strained to listen, but the words were indistinct, like the sound of wind rustling through dead leaves. Slowly they grew louder, closer, until they were all around him, filling his mind, drowning out everything else. "Ethan," they whispered, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "Come with us. Let go." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel the darkness closing in, the whispers tightening around his mind like a vice. He fought against them, tried to hold on to his own thoughts, his own sense of self. But the whispers were insistent, relentless, their voices sweet and soothing, promising him peace, an end to the fear and loneliness. He stumbled through the darkness, his arms outstretched, searching for something, anything that would anchor him, keep him from being swept away by the void. The ground beneath his feet was cold, uneven, and he could feel the dampness seeping into his skin, chilling him to the core. He kept moving, driven by a desperate need to escape, to find a way out of the darkness. But there was no escape. The shadows shifted and moved, their shapes twisting and writhing, always just beyond the edge of his vision. He could hear them, whispering, laughing, their voices echoing through the void. They were playing with him, drawing him deeper into their embrace, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. He stumbled, his foot catching on something unseen, and he fell, his hands hitting the cold, wet ground. Pain shot through his palms, and he gritted his teeth, struggling to push himself back up. But the shadows were there, wrapping around his arms, his legs, pulling him down, holding him in place. He fought against them, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let go, Ethan," the whispers urged, their voices soft and soothing. "There is nothing left for you. No one is coming for you. Just let go." Ethan closed his eyes, his body shaking with the effort of resisting. He could feel the tears burning in his eyes, the despair rising inside him, threatening to swallow him whole. He was alone, truly alone. There was no one coming to save him, no one who even knew he was here. The darkness was all that remained, and the longer he fought, the more he felt himself slipping away. He wanted to give in, to let go, to end the pain, the fear, the loneliness. The whispers promised him peace, an end to the struggle. All he had to do was let go. Slowly, his hands relaxed, his body going limp, and he felt himself sinking into the darkness, the shadows wrapping around him like a shroud. But then, through the haze of despair, he heard something, a sound, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was a voice, calling his name, not like the whispers, but real, human. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his heart skipping a beat. He listened, straining to hear, his breath caught in his throat. "Ethan!" the voice called again, louder this time, more insistent. It was a woman's voice, familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. It cut through the darkness, a lifeline that he grasped onto with all his strength. He struggled against the shadows, his body trembling, his muscles straining, and slowly, he felt them begin to loosen their grip. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, their voices overlapping, a cacophony that filled his mind, urging him to stay, to let go. But the other voice, the real voice, was stronger, pulling him back, giving him something to hold on to. He pushed himself up, his body shaking, and stumbled forward, following the sound. The darkness seemed to recoil, the shadows retreating, parting before him as he moved. He could feel the cold still clinging to him, the dampness seeping into his bones. But the voice was there, guiding him, leading him out of the void. He stumbled forward, his feet unsteady, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and slowly he began to see a light, faint, distant, but growing brighter with each step. He moved toward it, his heart pounding, the whispers fading, their voices growing weaker, more distant. The light grew brighter, cutting through the darkness, and Ethan felt a warmth spreading through him, chasing away the cold, the fear. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the light, and suddenly, he was falling, the darkness giving way, the shadows dissolving around him. Ethan hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of him. He lay there, gasping, his body trembling, his eyes blinking against the sudden brightness. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his hands shaking, and looked around. He was no longer in the hallway, no longer surrounded by darkness. He was in a room, small and cluttered, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper, the air thick with dust. A woman stood across the room, her eyes wide with concern, her hands trembling. She was familiar, though Ethan couldn't quite place her. She took a step toward him, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Ethan, are you okay?" He stared at her, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The shadows were gone, the whispers silent, but the memory of them lingered, an ache deep inside him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman moved closer, her eyes searching his, and she reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "It's okay," she said, her voice soothing, her touch warm. "You're safe now." Ethan closed his eyes, his body sagging with exhaustion. He could still feel the cold, the darkness, the whispers, but they were fading, slipping away, replaced by the warmth of her touch, the sound of her voice. He didn't know who she was, or how she had found him, but in that moment, he didn't care. He was no longer alone, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to hope. The woman helped him to his feet, her arm around his shoulders, steadying him. Together, they moved toward the door, the light beyond growing brighter, warmer as they stepped through. The darkness was behind them now, the whispers nothing more than a distant memory, and as they walked, Ethan felt a glimmer of something he had thought he'd lost forever, a sense of self, a sense of hope. He didn't know what lay ahead, or if the shadows would return, but for now, he was free. And as they stepped out into the light, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the world he had lost. Chapter 5. The Echoes of Fear. Ethan stumbled through the doorway, supported by the woman's arm, her presence a steadying force in the tumult of his emotions. The warm light enveloped them both, bathing the small room in a gentle glow that felt almost unreal after the oppressive darkness he had just escaped. His feet shuffled against the wooden floor, his legs trembling as he struggled to remain upright. He had no idea where he was, or even how he had come to be here. But he didn't care. All that mattered was that he was no longer alone. The woman led him to a small, worn sofa that sat against the far wall, guiding him to sit down. Ethan sank into the cushions, his body sagging with exhaustion. The warmth of the room was comforting, almost lulling him to sleep, but the fear still clung to him, a gnawing dread just beneath the surface. He looked up at the woman, his eyes searching her face. There was something about her, something familiar that he couldn't quite place. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper, hoarse from the strain of his ordeal. The woman knelt in front of him, her gaze softening. She had dark eyes, kind but intense, filled with an emotion he couldn't quite read. "My name is Claire," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, as if she was trying not to startle him. "I've been looking for you, Ethan. You're not alone anymore." The words hit him like a shock, and he closed his eyes, a shiver running through him. "How do you know me?" he asked, struggling to make sense of everything. His memories were still a blur, flashes of the darkness, the whispers, the cold that had seeped into his bones. The shadows felt like they were still wrapped around his mind, making it hard to think clearly. Claire hesitated, her eyes flickering to the door they had just come through. She seemed to be considering something, weighing her words carefully. "We've met before," she said finally, her voice gentle. "You may not remember it now, but we've met. I was looking for you, just like you were looking for a way out." Ethan opened his eyes, a confused frown creasing his forehead. He tried to recall her face, tried to pull the memory from the fog that clouded his thoughts, but it was like grasping at smoke, impossible to hold on to. I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. The fear was still there, lurking just out of sight, and he could feel it trying to claw its way back in. Claire placed a hand on his knee, her touch firm, grounding him. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to understand everything right now. The shadows, what you went through, it's not something that just goes away. It leaves marks, but you're not alone. We'll face it together." Ethan looked down at her hand, then back to her eyes. There was something in the way she spoke, something about her presence that made him want to believe her. He nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. "How did you find me?" Claire's gaze turned distant for a moment, her eyes clouding over as if she were remembering something painful. "I've been searching for people like you for a long time," she said quietly. "The darkness, the shadows, they're not just in your head. They're real and they're everywhere. Most people can't see them, but some of us, we can. We're the ones they want the most." A chill ran through Ethan at her words. He thought of the whispers, the cold touch of the shadows, the way they had tried to drag him into their void. He shivered, wrapping his arms around himself. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why do they want us?" Claire shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that they feed on fear, on loneliness. They thrive in the dark places, the empty places where hope is hardest to find. That's why we need each other. Alone, we're vulnerable, but together, we have a chance." Ethan closed his eyes, her words sinking in. He had felt it, the way the darkness had grown stronger when he was alone, the way the whispers had fed on his fear, his despair. But now, with Claire beside him, the cold didn't seem quite as overwhelming. The whispers were still there, faint and distant, but they were no longer deafening. He could feel a flicker of warmth, a glimmer of hope that he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Claire stood, her gaze never leaving his face. "We can't stay here," she said. "It's not safe. The shadows, they know where you are now and they'll come for you again. We need to keep moving." Ethan nodded, though the thought of leaving the small, warm room filled him with a sense of dread. He didn't want to go back out into the unknown, didn't want to face the shadows again. But he knew she was right. The darkness wouldn't just let him go. It would follow, creeping back in, unless he kept moving, unless he found a way to fight it. Claire helped him to his feet, her arms steady around his waist. He leaned on her, his legs still weak, his body trembling. Together they moved toward the door, the light flickering as they approached. Ethan paused, his gaze lingering on the threshold, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. The whispers were still out there, waiting, and he could feel their pull, the way they seemed to call to him, promising an end to the struggle. "Stay with me," Claire said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "Focus on me, Ethan. Don't listen to them." He nodded, taking a deep breath, and stepped through the doorway, the light fading behind them. The hallway beyond was dim, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in stains, dark patches that seemed to pulse and writhe in the shadows. Ethan swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness was still there, lurking, waiting for him to let his guard down. They moved cautiously, Claire leading the way, her eyes darting around, her body tense. Ethan could feel her fear, but it was different from his own. It wasn't paralyzing. It was focused, sharp, driving her forward. He tried to draw strength from her, tried to match her determination, but the whispers were growing louder, and he could feel the fear clawing at the edges of his mind. As they reached the end of the hallway, Claire paused, her hand tightening on his arm. She turned to him, her expression serious. "Whatever happens, don't let go of me," she said. "The shadows, they'll try to separate us. They'll use whatever they can, your fears, your doubts, but you have to hold on. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, hold on to me." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He could see the fear in her eyes, the weight of what she was asking of him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and squeezed her hand. "I won't let go," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Claire gave him a small, strained smile, and then turned, pushing open the door at the end of the hallway. Beyond it lay darkness, deep, impenetrable, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled his mind, urging him to step forward, to let go. But Claire's hand was warm in his, her grip strong, and he held on to her with all his strength. Together, they stepped into the darkness, the shadows closing in around them, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Ethan could feel the fear rising inside him, the cold seeping into his bones, but he focused on Claire, on the warmth of her hand, the steadiness of her presence. The darkness pressed against them, a living thing, shifting and moving, trying to tear them apart. Ethan could feel the shadows wrapping around him, pulling at him, and for a moment, he thought he could see shapes in the darkness. Faces, twisted and grotesque, their mouths open in silent screams. He closed his eyes, his grip tightening on Claire's hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Don't let go," Claire's voice came, her words a lifeline in the chaos. "We're almost there, Ethan. Just a little further." He nodded, his eyes still closed, and took a step forward, then another. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices overlapping, blending together, trying to drown out Claire's voice. But he held on, his fingers intertwined with hers, his focus on her, on the warmth of her touch. And then, suddenly, the darkness began to recede. The whispers grew fainter, the cold loosening its grip, and Ethan opened his eyes to see a light ahead. Small, flickering, but growing brighter with each step. He stumbled toward it, his legs weak, his body trembling, and slowly, the shadows fell away, the light enveloping them. They stepped out into a wide open space, a courtyard, overgrown with weeds, the walls crumbling, but bathed in sunlight. Ethan blinked against the sudden brightness, his eyes adjusting, and turned to Claire. She was breathing heavily, her face pale, but she gave him a tired smile. "We made it," she said, her voice filled with relief. Ethan looked around, his heart still pounding, the fear still there, but quieter now. The shadows were behind them, the whispers nothing more than a distant echo. He took a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Chapter 6. A flicker of light. The courtyard was silent except for the soft rustle of the wind through the overgrown weeds. The sunlight filtered through the crumbling walls, bathing everything in a warm glow, but the shadows still lingered at the edges, creeping along the ground, watching, waiting. Ethan took in a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, pushing away the cold that had settled deep within him. He could feel the fear still there, but it was muted now, like a distant memory, held at bay by the light. Claire turned to him, her eyes still wary. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might draw the shadows back. She squeezed his hand, a gentle reminder that they weren't safe yet. Ethan nodded, swallowing his fear, and followed her as she led him across the courtyard. The ground was uneven, the stones cracked and broken, weeds growing up through the gaps, but the sunlight warmed his skin, giving him strength. They reached the far side of the courtyard, where an archway stood, its stone pillars crumbling and weathered. Beyond it lay another hallway, dark and foreboding, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The whispers were still out there, somewhere, waiting for him to falter. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the archway, the memory of the whispers clawing at his mind. "Ethan," Claire said, her voice pulling him back. He turned to her, her eyes steady on his. "We have to keep going. I know it's hard, but we can't stop now." She reached out, her hand resting on his arm, grounding him. "I'm right here. I won't leave you." Ethan took a deep breath, nodding. He could feel the fear clawing at the edges of his mind, but Claire's presence was like a beacon, a light that kept the darkness at bay. He stepped forward, his heart pounding, and together they passed under the archway, the shadows closing in around them. The hallway was dark, the air heavy and damp, the walls covered in a thick layer of grime. Ethan could barely see, the dim light from the courtyard fading behind them, leaving only the faintest glow to guide their way. He kept his eyes on Claire, her silhouette barely visible in the gloom, her hand warm in his. The whispers were distant now, a soft murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the dark. They moved slowly, cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floor. The air was stifling, each breath feeling like it took more effort than the last. Ethan could feel the fear growing, the darkness pressing in on him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He squeezed Claire's hand, his grip tightening as the shadows seemed to shift and move, creeping closer. "Don't let go," Claire said, her voice a steady anchor in the dark. "Just keep moving, Ethan. We're almost there." He nodded, his throat tight, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the darkness watching him, the shadows reaching out, and he forced himself to focus on Claire, on the warmth of her hand, the sound of her voice. He couldn't let go. Not now. Not when they were so close. Suddenly, the hallway opened up into a large room, the ceiling high above them, the walls lined with broken windows. The faint light from the courtyard filtered through the shattered glass, casting long, fractured shadows across the floor. Ethan stumbled forward, his legs weak, and Claire caught him, her arm steady around his waist. "We made it," she said, her voice filled with relief. She led him to a small bench that sat against the wall, guiding him to sit down. Ethan sank onto the bench, his body trembling, the adrenaline that had kept him moving finally beginning to fade. He looked around the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor littered with debris. It looked like no one had been here in years. Claire knelt in front of him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, concerned. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He felt exhausted, his body aching, his mind still clouded with the memory of the darkness, the whispers. But he was here, he had made it, and Claire was with him. That was enough for now. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I think so." Claire gave him a small, reassuring smile, her hand resting on his knee. "You did good, Ethan. We're safe now, at least for a little while." He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, letting her words wash over him. Safe. It was a word he hadn't let himself think of in what felt like an eternity. He could still feel the fear, the cold, the whispers, but they were distant now, held at bay by the light, by Claire's presence. He opened his eyes, looking at her, his gaze filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. Claire squeezed his knee, her smile widening. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together, remember?" She stood, her gaze turning toward the broken windows, her expression growing serious. "But we can't stay here forever. The shadows, they'll find us. They always do." Ethan followed her gaze, his eyes drifting to the windows, the darkness beyond. He knew she was right. The whispers would come for him again. They would never stop, not until they had him. He felt a chill run through him, the fear stirring once more. But he pushed it down, forcing himself to focus on the light, on Claire. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire turned back to him, her eyes filled with determination. "We keep moving," she said. "There's a place, somewhere the shadows can't reach us. I don't know if we can make it, but we have to try. It's the only way." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if he had the strength to keep going, to face the darkness again, but he knew he couldn't stay here. Not if the shadows were still out there, waiting. He took a deep breath, pushing himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. "Okay," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "Let's go." Claire smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She reached out, taking his hand, her grip firm, reassuring. "We'll make it, Ethan. Together." They moved toward the far end of the room, where a doorway stood, the darkness beyond it deep and foreboding. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on the shadows, the memory of the whispers still fresh in his mind. But Claire's hand was warm in his, her presence steady beside him, and he took a deep breath, stepping forward. The doorway led to another hallway, this one narrower, the walls closer, the air heavy and damp. The light from the broken windows faded behind them, leaving only the faintest glow to guide their way. Ethan kept his eyes on Claire, her silhouette barely visible in the gloom, her hand warm in his. The whispers were distant now, a soft murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the dark. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floor. The air was stifling, each breath feeling like it took more effort than the last. Ethan could feel the fear growing, the darkness pressing in on him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He squeezed Claire's hand, his grip tightening as the shadows seemed to shift and move, creeping closer. "Don't let go," Claire said, her voice a steady anchor in the dark. "Just keep moving, Ethan. We're almost there." He nodded, his throat tight, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the darkness watching him, the shadows reaching out, and he forced himself to focus on Claire, on the warmth of her hand, the sound of her voice. He couldn't let go. Not now, not when they were so close. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness deepening with each step, the whispers growing louder, a chorus of voices overlapping, blending together, trying to drown out Claire's voice. Ethan could feel his strength fading, the fear clawing at his mind, but he held on, his fingers intertwined with Claire's, his focus on her, on the warmth of her presence. And then, suddenly, the darkness began to recede. The whispers grew fainter, the cold loosening its grip, and Ethan opened his eyes to see a light ahead, small, flickering, but growing brighter with each step. He stumbled toward it, his legs weak, his body trembling. And slowly, the shadows fell away, the light enveloping them. They stepped out into another open space, a courtyard much like the one before, but larger, the walls higher, the sunlight brighter. Ethan blinked against the sudden brightness, his eyes adjusting, and turned to Claire. She was breathing heavily, her face pale, but she gave him a tired smile. "We made it," she said, her voice filled with relief. Ethan looked around, his heart still pounding, the fear still there, but quieter now. The shadows were behind them, the whispers nothing more than a distant echo. He took a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Chapter 7. The edge of despair. The courtyard was larger than the last, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves of overgrown vines, casting delicate patterns across the cracked stone floor. The air was warmer here, the wind carrying the scent of something familiar, a sweetness that reminded Ethan of a distant memory he couldn't quite grasp. He paused, taking in his surroundings, the brightness almost blinding after the darkness of the hallway. Claire stood beside him, her expression cautious but hopeful. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful, as if they were on the edge of something better, but the shadows lingered, waiting at the corners of his vision. He could feel them, just beyond the reach of the light, their presence like a weight pressing down on him, refusing to let him forget they were still there. He turned to Claire, his eyes meeting hers, searching for reassurance. She gave him a small smile, her hand still holding his, her grip gentle but firm. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Ethan could see the toll that their journey had taken on her. Lines of worry etched on her face, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. But she kept going, kept pushing forward, because they had no choice. The shadows would not rest, and neither could they. Ethan nodded, swallowing his fear, and together they moved across the courtyard. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, stones shifting as they stepped, the vines tangling around their ankles. Claire led the way, her eyes scanning the courtyard, looking for a path forward. They reached the far wall, where an old wooden door stood, its surface weathered and splintered with age. Claire hesitated, her gaze lingering on the door, then turned to Ethan. "Stay close to me," she said. "We don't know what's on the other side." Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding, and nodded. He tightened his grip on Claire's hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his, and together they pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing through the quiet courtyard, and beyond it lay another hallway, dark, narrow, the air thick with the scent of mildew and damp stone. The light from the courtyard faded as they stepped through the doorway, replaced by the cold, oppressive darkness. The walls seemed to close in on them, the shadows deeper here, the whispers louder. Ethan could hear them, just beyond the edges of his perception, a murmur that grew louder with each step they took. He forced himself to focus on Claire, on the sound of her breathing, the feel of her hand in his. But the darkness was relentless, the whispers insistent. "Ethan," they whispered, his name echoing through the hallway, the voices overlapping, a chorus that filled his mind, drowning out everything else. "Ethan, come to us, join us, let go." His breath caught in his throat, his body trembling. He could feel the cold seeping into his skin, the fear clawing at his mind, and for a moment he thought about letting go, about giving in to the darkness, letting it take him. It would be easier, he thought, to just stop fighting, to let the whispers swallow him whole. But Claire's hand was warm in his, her presence steady beside him, and he held on, his grip tightening. "Don't listen to them," Claire said, her voice breaking through the whispers, cutting through the fog that clouded his thoughts. "They're not real, Ethan. You have to stay with me." He nodded, his throat tight, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He focused on her, on the sound of her voice, and took another step forward, then another. The hallway seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on them, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He could see shapes in the shadows, faces, twisted and grotesque, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for him, their hands like claws, and he closed his eyes, his heart pounding, his mind screaming at him to run, to get away. But Claire was there, her hand in his, her voice steady, guiding him forward. He could feel her strength, her determination, and he drew from it, forcing himself to move, to keep going. The darkness was suffocating, the cold seeping into his bones, but he kept his focus on Claire, on the warmth of her presence, the light that she seemed to carry with her, even in the depths of the shadows. Suddenly, the hallway opened up into a large chamber, the ceiling high above them, the walls lined with tall, narrow windows. The light from outside filtered in, dim and pale, but enough to push back the darkness to keep the shadows at bay. Ethan stumbled forward, his legs weak, and Claire caught him, her arm around his waist, steadying him. "Just a little further," she said, her voice filled with relief. She led him to a stone bench that sat against the wall, guiding him to sit down. Ethan sank onto the bench, his body trembling, his mind still clouded with the memory of the darkness, the whispers. But the light was here, and Claire was with him, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe that they were safe. He looked around the chamber, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were covered in carvings, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light. He frowned, his gaze tracing the lines, trying to make sense of them. There was something familiar about the patterns, something that tugged at the edges of his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire looked around, her eyes narrowing as she studied the carvings. "I don't know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "but it feels different, like it's holding the darkness back." Ethan nodded, his gaze still on the carvings. The whispers were quieter here, the cold less biting, and he could feel a sense of calm beginning to settle over him. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, pushing away the fear that still lingered at the edges of his mind. Claire sat down beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "You did good, Ethan," she said, her voice soft. "We made it this far. We're going to be okay." He opened his eyes, turning to look at her. There was a warmth in her gaze, a kindness that made his chest ache. He nodded, his throat tight. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice trembling. Claire smiled, her eyes shining. "We're in this together," she said. "And we're going to keep going. We're going to find a way out of this." Ethan took a deep breath, the fear still there, but quieter now, held at bay by the light, by Claire's presence. He nodded, his resolve strengthening. "What do we do now?" he asked. Claire looked around the chamber, her gaze lingering on the carvings. "There has to be a way forward," she said. "A way to keep moving. The shadows, they won't stop, but maybe we can find something here, something to help us." Ethan followed her gaze, his eyes drifting to the carvings on the walls. There was something about them, something that called to him, that seemed to speak to a part of him that he didn't quite understand. He stood, his legs still shaky, and moved closer to the wall, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. The lines of the carvings seemed to shift beneath his touch, the patterns flowing like water, and he felt a strange warmth spread through him, a light that seemed to push back the darkness. "Ethan!" Claire's voice was filled with concern, and he turned to her, his hand still on the wall. "I think," he began, his voice trailing off. He frowned, his gaze returning to the carvings. "I think this is the way. I don't know how, but I can feel it." Claire stood, moving to his side, her eyes on the wall. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the stone beside his, and for a moment, the carving seemed to glow, a soft light that spread through the chamber, pushing back the shadows. Claire's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Ethan, what is this?" He shook his head, his heart pounding. "I don't know," he said, "but it feels right, like it's showing us the way." Claire nodded, her gaze steady on his. "Then let's follow it," she said. "Whatever it is, it's better than staying here." Ethan took a deep breath, his hand still on the wall, the warmth of the light filling him, giving him strength. He nodded, his resolve solidifying. Together, they moved along the wall, their hands tracing the lines of the carvings, the light growing brighter with each step. The shadows seemed to recoil, the whispers fading, and for the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way out of the darkness. The carvings led them to the far end of the chamber, where another doorway stood, the wood old and weathered, but the light from the carvings seemed to flow into it, illuminating the path ahead. Claire turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with determination. "Are you ready?" she asked. He nodded, his heart pounding, the fear still there, but no longer overwhelming. He reached for the door, his hand steady, and pushed it open. Beyond it lay another hallway, but this one was different. The light from the carvings flowed into it, pushing back the darkness, the whispers silent. They stepped through the doorway, the light guiding their way, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to believe that they were on the path to something better, something beyond the shadows, beyond the fear. And with Claire by his side, he knew they would face whatever lay ahead, together. Chapter 9. The Beacon and the Abyss. The light flared from the carvings, washing over the chamber, a radiant warmth that seemed to reach into Ethan's very soul. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could sense something other than fear, something that felt like hope. The darkness was pushed back, the whispers silenced, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Claire, her face illuminated by the glow, her eyes wide with awe. "What is this place?" Ethan asked, his voice a hushed whisper. The chamber seemed alive, pulsing with a gentle rhythmic energy. The carvings on the walls glowed like 1,000 constellations, forming symbols and patterns that shifted as he watched, as though the chamber was breathing. Claire shook her head, her eyes never leaving the wall. "I don't know," she said softly, "but it feels ancient, powerful, like it's something meant to protect us." She reached out, her fingers brushing the glowing lines, and the light seemed to respond, brightening where she touched it, rippling like water. Ethan felt a pull deep within him, an instinct that told him they were meant to be here. He stepped closer to the wall, his hand moving almost of its own accord, tracing the lines that seemed to guide his touch. The light flared again, growing brighter, filling the chamber with a warm golden glow. He could feel something shifting beneath his fingertips. A connection, an understanding that was just out of reach. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Do you feel it too?" she asked. "It's like it's trying to tell us something." Ethan nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. He could feel it, a presence, a consciousness within the carvings, something that was alive in its own way. It wasn't speaking to him in words, but in emotions, in images that flashed through his mind, images of light and darkness, of struggle and hope. He saw shadows creeping across the land, consuming everything in their path, and he saw a light, small at first, but growing, pushing back the darkness, shining brightly against the encroaching void. "It's a beacon," Ethan said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's showing us a way out, a way to fight the darkness." He turned to Claire, his eyes wide. "This place, these carvings, they're a message. They're telling us we have the power to resist, to push back against the shadows." Claire's eyes filled with tears, her face a mixture of relief and determination. "Then we can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to take this light with us. We have to find a way to use it, to protect ourselves and anyone else out there." Ethan nodded, a new resolve forming within him. He looked at the glowing carvings, the warmth of the light spreading through him, strengthening him. They had come so far, faced so much, and now they had a chance, no matter how small, to change things. He wasn't going to let it slip away. They moved together to the center of the chamber, where the light glowed brightest, its warmth almost tangible. The carvings seemed to spiral inward, forming a circle that pulsed with energy, the patterns converging into a single point. Ethan felt a deep resonance within him, a sense of purpose that filled the emptiness that had been gnawing at him since the darkness had first closed in. Claire knelt beside the glowing center, her hand hovering over the light. She looked up at Ethan, her expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "If we do this," she said, her voice barely audible, "there's no turning back. We'll be carrying the light with us. The darkness will come for us harder than before." Ethan swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew she was right. The shadows wouldn't rest. They would never stop. But he also knew that they couldn't stay here, hiding forever. If there was a chance to fight, to make it out of this nightmare, He had to take it. He reached down, his hand covering hers, his eyes meeting hers. "We have to try," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't keep running forever." Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Together they pressed their hands to the center of the glowing carvings, and the light surged, a wave of warmth that spread through the chamber, filling every corner, every shadow. Ethan felt it move through him, a powerful force that pushed back against the darkness, that filled him with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. The chamber seemed to come alive around them, the light growing brighter, the carvings shifting and changing, the patterns forming symbols that seemed to burn with a fierce intensity. Ethan closed his eyes, his mind overwhelmed by the sheer power of it, the warmth that seemed to radiate from deep within his very being. He felt Claire's hand tighten on his, her presence grounding him, anchoring him in the midst of the blazing light. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, the chamber returning to its dim, flickering glow. Ethan opened his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling. The carvings still glowed, but they were softer now, their light less intense, more subdued. He turned to Claire, her face pale, her eyes wide, but filled with a fierce determination. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We took the light." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding, the warmth still lingering within him. He could feel it, a presence, a power that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, a flicker deep within him, but it was there, a spark of light that pushed back against the darkness that still lingered at the edges of his mind. He looked at Claire, his eyes filled with gratitude, and she smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We have to go," she said, her voice steadying. "The shadows. They'll know. They'll come for us." Ethan nodded, his resolve solidifying. They had taken the light, but now they had to protect it. They had to keep moving, to find a way to use it against the darkness. He took a deep breath, the warmth of the light filling him, and stood, his hand still holding Claire's. Together they moved toward the doorway, the carvings lighting their way, the path ahead filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. The hallway beyond the chamber was dark, the air heavy and cold, but the light within them seemed to push back against it. The shadows retreating, the whispers silenced, they moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls, the darkness pressing in on them, but unable to touch them. Ethan could feel the light, a warmth deep within him, a flicker that gave him strength, that kept the fear at bay. They moved through the labyrinth, the pathways winding and twisting, the walls pressing close, the darkness deepening with each step, but the light was there, a presence within them, guiding them, keeping them on the right path. Ethan could feel it, an instinct that told him which way to go, which turns to take. It was as if the carvings had become a part of him, their light now intertwined with his very being. Claire led the way, her hand still holding his, her eyes focused, her expression determined. She moved with a confidence that filled Ethan with hope, her strength a steadying force that kept him going, even when the darkness seemed to close in around them. He could feel the fear still there, the whispers beginning to stir once more, but the light pushed back, silencing them, keeping them at bay. The labyrinth seemed endless, the pathways stretching on and on, the darkness unrelenting. But they kept moving, step by step, the light within them growing stronger with each turn, each step forward. Ethan could feel it, the warmth spreading through him, filling him with a sense of purpose, a determination that he hadn't known he possessed. Finally, they reached the edge of the labyrinth, the walls opening up into another chamber, this one smaller, more enclosed, the air thick with the scent of damp stone. The carvings on the walls were faint, their light almost extinguished, but the glow within Ethan and Claire seemed to brighten, pushing back the darkness, filling the chamber with a soft, golden light. Ethan stumbled forward, his legs weak, his body trembling with exhaustion. Claire caught him, her arm around his waist, steadying him. "We're almost there," she said, her voice filled with encouragement. "Just a little further." He nodded, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The light was still there, but it was flickering. The strength he had felt beginning to wane. He could feel the darkness pressing in on them, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They were close, but they weren't safe yet. Claire led him to a small alcove, the walls covered in carvings that seemed to pulse with a faint rhythmic light. She helped him sit down, her eyes scanning the chamber, her expression tense. "We need to rest," she said, her voice filled with concern. "We need to gather our strength before we move on." Ethan nodded, his body sagging with exhaustion. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the light still there, but dimmer now, a flicker that kept the darkness at bay. He could hear the whispers, distant but growing closer, and he knew they didn't have much time. But for now they were safe. For now they had a chance. Claire knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We're going to make it, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We have the light now. We have something they can't take from us." He opened his eyes, looking at her, his gaze filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice trembling. "You saved me." Claire smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We saved each other," she said softly. "And we're going to keep going. We're going to find a way out of this together." Ethan nodded, the fear still there, but quieter now, held at bay by the light, by Claire's presence. He took a deep breath, the warmth filling him, giving him strength. They had come so far, faced so much, and now they had a chance to fight, to survive, to find a way out of the darkness that had consumed their world. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to hope. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the light spreading through him, and he knew that no matter what lay ahead, he wouldn't face it alone. The darkness was still there, the whispers still waiting, but they had the light now, and together they would face whatever lay beyond the shadows. Chapter 10. The Last Threshold. The hallway stretched before them, unlike the oppressive darkness they had faced before. The carvings along the walls pulsed gently, casting a golden glow that illuminated their path, almost as if the ancient designs themselves were guiding them forward. Ethan walked slowly, his heart pounding in time with the gentle pulse of the light, each beat filling him with both hope and trepidation. Claire walked beside him, her eyes narrowed, focused on what lay ahead, her hand still tightly holding his. They moved in silence for a while, the quiet only broken by the faint scuff of their shoes against the stone floor. The air in this hallway felt different, cleaner, warmer. The darkness that had always seemed to cling to them now felt distant, like a bad dream that was finally beginning to fade. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, something waiting for them to drop their guard, to falter just enough for the shadows to creep back in. He tightened his grip on Claire's hand, and she gave him a reassuring squeeze. "We're close," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she feared that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile safety they had found. "I can feel it. The light. It's getting stronger." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. He could feel it too. The warmth of the light seemed to seep into his very being, filling him with strength, with purpose. It was as though the carvings on the walls were alive, their gentle pulse resonating with something deep inside him, guiding him, urging him onward. He took a deep breath, his steps growing more confident, his heart swelling with hope. The hallway twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the unknown. As they walked, the carvings on the walls became more intricate, their patterns more elaborate, forming symbols that seemed to shift and change as Ethan watched, as though they were telling a story of light and darkness, of hope and despair. The symbols seemed to speak to him, their meaning just out of reach, like a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Suddenly, the hallway opened up into a vast chamber, the ceiling soaring high above them, disappearing into the shadows. The carvings covered every inch of the walls, their light illuminating the space with a soft golden glow. At the far end of the chamber, a massive door stood, its surface covered in the same intricate carvings, the light flowing into it, as though the door itself was a part of the labyrinth they had been navigating. Claire stopped beside him, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. "This has to be it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The last threshold. Whatever is beyond that door. It's what we've been searching for." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the door. He could feel the power emanating from it, a warmth that seemed to call to him, urging him to move forward. But there was also something else, a sense of finality, of something waiting just beyond that door, something that would change everything. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to Claire, her eyes meeting his, her expression filled with determination. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the fear she felt. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. He could feel the fear too. A deep, primal fear that told him to turn back, to run, to hide. But the light was stronger, the warmth pushing back against the darkness, filling him with hope. He reached out, taking Claire's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Together," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "We face whatever's behind that door together." Claire smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Together," she echoed, her voice filled with a fierce determination. They moved across the chamber, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls, the light from the carvings growing brighter with each step. As they approached the door, Ethan could feel the power emanating from it growing stronger, a warmth that filled the air, that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. He reached out, his hand hovering over the surface of the door, the carvings glowing beneath his touch. The door seemed to respond to him, the light flowing into his hand, a warmth that spread through his arm, into his chest, filling him with a sense of purpose, of strength. He looked at Claire, her eyes wide, her hand still holding his, and together, they pushed. The door moved slowly, the stone grinding against the floor, the carvings glowing brighter and brighter until they were nearly blinding. The door swung open, revealing a staircase leading downward, the steps carved from the same stone as the rest of the labyrinth, the walls lined with the glowing carvings. Ethan took a deep breath, the air warm and fragrant, a sense of calm washing over him. He turned to Claire, her gaze meeting his, her eyes filled with determination. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The final path." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They had come so far, faced so much, and now they were standing on the threshold of something new, something that could change everything. He took a deep breath, his hand still holding Claire's, and together, they began to descend the staircase, the light from the carvings guiding their way. The steps seemed endless, spiraling down into the earth, the air growing warmer the deeper they went. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift and change as they descended, the symbols becoming more intricate, their meaning more elusive. Ethan could feel the power in the air, a presence that seemed to grow stronger with each step, filling him with both hope and fear. Finally, they reached the bottom of the staircase, the passage opening up into a large circular chamber. The walls were covered in the same glowing carvings, their light filling the space, casting long shadows across the floor. At the center of the chamber, a pedestal stood, its surface smooth and polished, the light from the carvings converging on it, as though the entire labyrinth had been leading them to this point. Claire stepped forward, her eyes wide, her gaze fixed on the pedestal. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The source of the light." Ethan followed her, his heart pounding, his gaze fixed on the pedestal. He could feel the power emanating from it, a warmth that filled the air, that seemed to call to him, urging him to step closer. He moved slowly, his hand reaching out, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the pedestal. The light flared, a blinding brilliance that filled the chamber, a warmth that spread through Ethan's entire body, filling him with strength, with hope. He could feel the power of the light, a presence that seemed to speak to him, a voice without words, a promise of something beyond the darkness, beyond the fear. Claire stepped beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes filled with tears. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "this is what we've been searching for. This is the key to pushing back the darkness." Ethan nodded, his throat tight, his eyes glistening. He could feel it, a deep, unyielding sense of purpose that filled him, that told him they were meant to be here, that they were meant to take this light and use it against the shadows that had haunted them for so long. He turned to Claire, his heart swelling with emotion. "We have to take it," he said, his voice trembling. "We have to use it to protect ourselves, to protect everyone out there." Claire nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to be the light, Ethan. We have to carry it with us no matter what." They reached out together, their hands resting on the surface of the pedestal, the light flaring once more, a warmth that filled them, that seemed to become a part of them. Ethan closed his eyes, the power of the light flowing through him, filling every corner of his being, pushing back the darkness that still lingered at the edges of his mind. The chamber seemed to come alive around them, the carvings glowing with an intensity that filled the space, that pushed back every shadow, every whisper. Ethan could feel it, the light, the warmth, the hope that filled him, that filled Claire, that filled the entire chamber. It was as though the light had become a part of him, a presence that would never leave him, no matter what lay ahead. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, the chamber returning to its dim, flickering glow. Ethan opened his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling. The carvings still glowed, but they were softer now, their light less intense, more subdued. He turned to Claire, her face pale, her eyes wide, but filled with a fierce determination. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We took the light." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding, the warmth still lingering within him. He could feel it, a presence, a power that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, a flicker deep within him, but it was there, a spark of light that pushed back against the darkness that still lingered at the edges of his mind. He looked at Claire, his eyes filled with gratitude, and she smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We have to go," she said, her voice steadying. "The shadows, they will keep coming, but now we have something they cannot take from us." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "We carry the light with us," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We face the darkness, and we fight back." Claire took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "No matter what," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. With a final glance at the pedestal, they turned and began to make their way back up the staircase, the glow of the carvings guiding them, the warmth of the light still within them, a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. The shadows would come, they knew that now, but they were no longer the frightened souls who had stumbled through the labyrinth, haunted by whispers and unseen horrors. They were the bearers of the light, and they would face whatever lay ahead, together. And as they stepped out of the labyrinth, the darkness seemed to pause, as if it knew that something had changed. The whispers were still there, a distant murmur that would never fully disappear, but they were quieter now, their power diminished by the light that Ethan and Claire carried within them. The journey was far from over, but as they looked out into the world beyond, they knew they had found something worth fighting for. A spark of hope, a beacon in the darkness. And as long as they had each other, as long as they held on to the light, they knew they could face whatever came their way. Together, they stepped forward, into the unknown, the light within them shining brightly against the encroaching shadows. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to believe that they could win, that the light could, and would, prevail. Epilogue. A new dawn. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, its golden rays spilling across the landscape, pushing back the remnants of the night. Ethan and Claire stood at the edge of a hill, the warmth of the morning sun washing over them, the light within them resonating with the dawn. They had made it out of the labyrinth, but their journey was only just beginning. The world was still filled with shadows, still haunted by whispers, but now there was hope. Now there was light. And as the first birds began to sing, their voices filling the air with a promise of a new day, Ethan turned to Claire, his heart swelling with determination. "We keep moving," he said, his voice steady. "We find others. We spread the light." Claire smiled, her eyes shining with hope. "Together," she said. And as they began to walk, hand in hand, the light of the dawn mingling with the light they carried within. They knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it. Together, they would fight the darkness. And one day, they would see a world where the shadows no longer held sway. A world where the light had won,